I walked into my brother's lavish engagement party at Atlanta's most exclusive luxury hotel, only for his bride-to-be to shove her empty champagne glass directly into my hand. She looked me up and down and sneered that the country girl needed to stay in the back so I would not ruin their high society aesthetic. I did not yell or cause a scene. I simply smiled, held her discarded glass, and watched her strut away. She had absolutely no idea that she was insulting me while standing in the center of a $42 million lobby that I had purchased in cash just 6 months prior. My name is Naomi. I am 35 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Hospitality Group. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to endure family members who constantly underestimated your worth and treated you like a second-class citizen. The cool autumn air of Atlanta brushed against my face as I stepped out of my black town car and looked up at the towering facade of the Grand Azure. The building was a masterpiece of modern architecture mixed with classic Southern elegance, its massive glass windows reflecting the vibrant city lights. It was the absolute crown jewel of my real estate portfolio, though no one in my family knew that. To them, I was just Naomi, the difficult daughter who fled to a quiet estate in the country because she supposedly could not handle the pressure of city life. I smoothed the lapels of my silver bespoke suit. It was tailored to perfection, a subtle armor I wore to protect myself from the inevitable emotional warfare that always came with attending any family gathering. I walked through the heavy brass revolving doors and stepped into the grand marble lobby. The space was breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the imported Italian marble floors. A soft jazz quartet played beautifully in the corner, their notes blending seamlessly with the quiet chatter of wealthy patrons and the delicate clinking of fine crystal. I took a deep breath, grounding myself. I was here for my younger brother Trey. Despite his many flaws and our strained history, he was getting married, and I had promised myself I would show up and be a supportive older sister. Before I could even reach the mahogany coat check counter to drop off my belongings, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the ambient noise of the lobby. "Well, look who decided to show up." I turned around to see Simone Trey's fiancé gliding toward me with alarming speed. Simone was a stunning African-American woman who always carried herself with an intense air of superiority. She was dressed in a pristine white designer gown that hugged her figure tightly, her neck glittering with heavy diamonds that I strongly suspected her father had purchased on credit just to keep up appearances. Simone came from a family that prided itself on their corporate connections and highly visible wealth. From the very first moment Trey introduced us, she had made it her personal mission to remind me that she viewed me as entirely beneath her station. Simone stopped mere inches from me, her dark eyes sweeping over my silver suit with clear disdain. She did not offer a hug or even a polite greeting. Without missing a beat, she thrust her empty champagne glass directly into my hand, treating me as if I were one of the passing busboys hired for the evening. "The country girl is actually here," Simone said, her voice dripping with overwhelming condescension. "Listen, do us a huge favor and stay near the back tonight, Naomi. My parents have some very important corporate partners arriving soon from a major logistics firm. We need to project a certain aesthetic, and your whole rustic, isolated vibe really does not fit the high-class image we are going for. We cannot have you confusing the important guests or asking them awkward questions about things you do not understand." I looked down at the empty glass in my hand, feeling the cool condensation against my skin. The sheer audacity of her statement was almost comical. Simone was standing in a lobby that generated more revenue in a single weekend than her father's entire logistics company made in a full quarter. She was brazenly lecturing me about corporate aesthetics while standing on floors I legally owned, drinking expensive champagne sourced from my private cellars and breathing air conditioned by my state-of-the-art facilities. The old Naomi, the young woman who spent her 20s desperately seeking validation from our parents, might have crumbled under that heavy insult. She might have apologized profusely, shrunk into herself, and found a dark corner to hide in for the rest of the night. But that woman was long gone. The woman standing in the Grand Azur today was a self-made mogul who had fought tooth and nail to build a hospitality empire from the ground up, entirely free from the toxic conditional love of her family. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not throw the sticky glass back at her perfectly manicured hands. I just stood my ground and offered her a calm, polished, unbreakable smile. "Congratulations on your engagement, Simone," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of the fearful intimidation she was so desperately trying to provoke. "I will be sure to find my designated place." Simone narrowed her eyes, clearly unsatisfied with my lack of a dramatic emotional reaction. She huffed loudly, flipped her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, and turned on her heel to march back toward the grand ballroom. She was desperate to find an audience that would actually grovel at her feet and validate her inflated ego. I stood completely alone in the lobby for a moment, letting the soothing jazz music wash over me. I handed the empty glass to a passing waiter who immediately froze when he realized who I was. He opened his mouth to greet me formally, but I gave him a subtle, respectful nod and offered a tiny shake of my head. I was silently instructing him not to blow my cover just yet. I wanted to see exactly how far my family and my arrogant future sister-in-law were willing to take this elaborate charade of superiority. For years, Trey had been the undisputed golden child of our family. He was 32 years old and perpetually bouncing from one failed business venture to another, always bailed out by our parents, who willingly drained their own retirement accounts to fund his lavish, irresponsible lifestyle. Meanwhile, I was the designated scapegoat. When I asked for a small loan to start my very first business a decade ago, my parents laughed in my face and told me to get a safe, realistic job because I did not have the mind for enterprise. So I packed my bags, moved out of the city, and built my massive fortune in absolute silence. My family assumed my quiet life meant I was struggling financially. They had absolutely no idea I was buying up premium commercial real estate across the entire East Coast. As I adjusted my cuffs and prepared to walk into the main dining room, a quiet, undeniable thrill ran through my veins. Tonight was supposed to be Simone's grand performance, a night to flaunt her family's supposed power and put the lonely country girl firmly in her place. But they were playing a dangerous game of Monopoly on a board that I owned outright, and I was more than ready to let them roll the dice. I took exactly one step toward the arched entryway of the main dining room before two familiar figures blocked my path. It was my parents, David and Brenda. They moved with a frantic, nervous energy that sharply contrasted with the elegant surroundings of my hotel. My mother wore a dark navy evening gown that she had undoubtedly purchased just for this occasion, while my father adjusted the collar of a rented tuxedo that was slightly too tight around his shoulders. Instead of greeting me with the warmth a daughter might expect after not seeing her family for 6 months, my mother reached out and clamped her hand tightly around my forearm. Her acrylic nails dug uncomfortably into the expensive wool of my custom sleeve. "Naomi, please tell me you are not going to start anything tonight," my mother hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She glanced nervously over her shoulder to make sure Simone and her wealthy parents were out of earshot. "I saw Simone hand you that glass. I know you. I know you have that temper. Just let it go. Trey has finally found a girl from a genuinely good family, and we cannot afford for you to ruin this with your attitude." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, then back up to her face. The sheer irony of her words almost made me laugh out loud. I had not said a single negative word to Simone. I had stood perfectly still and taken her blatant disrespect with a smile. Yet somehow in my mother's warped version of reality, I was the one who needed to be managed. I was the volatile threat to my brother's perfect evening. "I am not starting anything, Mother," I replied, keeping my voice low and perfectly modulated. Simone handed me her garbage and I disposed of it for her. I am simply here to celebrate Trey just like you asked. My father stepped forward, his expression tight with disapproval. He ran a hand over his thinning gray hair and sighed heavily. Look, Naomi, we know it is hard for you to be back in the city, especially around people who are doing so well for themselves. We know you have struggled to find your footing out there in the country. But Simone comes from a family of highly successful entrepreneurs. Her father runs a massive logistics firm. They have real money and real influence. Trey needs this connection. He needs this marriage to work so he can finally get a stable executive position at his father-in-law's company. The blatant admission hung in the air between us. They were not just celebrating a union of love. They were celebrating a financial bailout for their 32-year-old son. For as long as I could remember, Trey had been the undisputed golden child. When he dropped out of college his sophomore year because the classes were too demanding, my parents nodded sympathetically and paid off his student loans. When he wanted to start a custom sneaker business that went bankrupt in less than 6 months, my father took out a second mortgage on their modest family home to cover his staggering business debts. They poured every ounce of their financial and emotional resources into making sure Trey never had to face the consequences of his own incompetence. Meanwhile, I was expected to figure everything out on my own. When I graduated at the top of my university class and asked for a tiny $5,000 loan to launch my very first hospitality management software, my father flatly refused. He told me I was living in a fantasy world and needed to find a safe hourly job. When I packed my bags and moved upstate to aggressively build my company in peace, they told their friends I had run away to the country to hide my failures. They genuinely believed I was living in a rundown cabin scraping by on pennies, completely unaware that my country estate sat on 40 acres of prime real estate and featured a private helipad. So Trey is marrying into money because he still refuses to earn his own, I stated calmly, looking directly into my father's eyes. And you want me to stay quiet and pretend I do not see how Simone treats people, just so Trey can secure a comfortable job he is completely unqualified for. My mother squeezed my arm harder, her eyes flashing with sudden anger. Do not speak about your brother that way. Trey has a brilliant mind for business. He just has not had the right backing yet. Simone's father understands his potential. And honestly, Naomi, you should be taking notes instead of passing judgment. Maybe if you paid attention tonight, you could learn a thing or two about how real wealth operates. You cannot hide out in the woods forever playing at being independent while the rest of the world passes you by. I gently but firmly detached my mother's hand from my arm. I smoothed out the wrinkle her grip had left on my silver sleeve. There was no point in arguing with them. There was no point in pulling out my phone and showing them the corporate profiles that highlighted my company's aggressive expansion across the East Coast. They were completely committed to the narrative they had constructed years ago. In their minds, Trey was the misunderstood genius on the brink of immense success, and I was the bitter, struggling spinster sister who needed to be kept out of sight. You are absolutely right, Mother, I said, my voice smooth as glass. I am sure I will learn a great deal tonight about how real wealth operates. I will blend right in. You will not even know I am here. My parents exchanged a look of profound relief, completely missing the heavy layer of sarcasm beneath my words. My father clapped his hands together once, a tight, forced smile appearing on his face. Good, he said briskly. Good. Now go find your seat. The catering staff is about to serve the first course, and Simone specifically arranged the seating chart to make sure everyone was comfortable. Do not make a fuss about where you are placed. Just sit down, eat your meal, and let Trey have his moment in the spotlight. They turned and hurried away, eagerly rushing toward the front of the dining room, where the elite members of Simone's family were gathered around a massive floral-draped head table. I watched them go, feeling a familiar dull ache in my chest. Even after all these years, a tiny buried part of me still wished they would turn around, look at me, and actually see the woman I had become. But the ache faded almost as quickly as it arrived, replaced by the cold, sharp focus that had made me a millionaire by the age of 30. I adjusted my posture, standing tall, and walked through the grand entryway into the ballroom. The space was magnificent, filled with the scent of fresh orchids and the soft hum of wealthy conversations. I was ready to find my seat, exactly as my father had instructed. I was ready to blend in. But I knew the moment I saw the seating chart, the illusion of family peace they were so desperately trying to maintain was going to shatter. I stepped through the towering double doors into the main ballroom, and the sheer scale of the space washed over me. I had personally approved the multi-million-dollar renovations for this exact room just last year. I chose the hand-painted silk drapery that cascaded down the walls, the custom ambient lighting system that cast a warm, flattering glow across the room, and the intricate gold leaf detailing on the vaulted ceiling. It was designed to be the premier event space in all of Atlanta, and seeing it fully dressed for an engagement party of this magnitude was a testament to my own vision. The room was filled with the soft chatter of wealthy guests, the clinking of crystal goblets, and the fragrance of thousands of fresh white roses. I navigated my way toward the ornate seating chart displayed on a massive gold-plated easel near the entrance. A crowd of impeccably dressed guests was gathered around it, tracing their manicured fingers down the elegant calligraphy to find their designated places. I waited politely for the crowd to thin before stepping up to the board. My eyes instinctively went to table 1, the family estate table. It was positioned right at the front of the room on a slightly elevated platform, ensuring that everyone seated there was the absolute center of attention. I read the names printed on the thick ivory cardstock: Trey, Simone, David, Brenda. Then came the names of Simone's parents, Richard and Beverly. Next to them were Simone's aunts, her uncles, and even her cousins. There were 12 seats at the head table occupied entirely by my parents, my brother, and his future-in-laws. My name was nowhere to be found. I felt a brief, hollow sting in my chest, but I quickly pushed it away. I continued to scan the list. Table 2. Table 3. I read through the names of distant relatives, corporate partners I had never met, and friends of the bride. I traced my finger down the board, moving further and further down the list, until I finally spotted my name. Table 24. I turned away from the seating chart and began to walk across the sprawling ballroom. As I moved away from the stage, the floral centerpieces on the tables grew noticeably smaller. The plush velvet chairs were replaced by standard banquet seating. The warm, ambient lighting gave way to the harsh fluorescent glare spilling out from the service hallways. I finally reached table 24. It was shoved into the absolute darkest, draftiest corner of the room, positioned less than 3 feet away from the heavy, swinging metal doors of the main catering kitchen. The temperature back here was a good 10 degrees colder than the rest of the room. Every few seconds, a waiter would burst through the doors, balancing a massive tray of appetizers, bringing with them a rush of cold air and the chaotic, shouting voices of the culinary staff. I looked at the people seated at my table. There was a young man aggressively changing the battery on a heavy camera, clearly the hired event photographer, taking a mandatory break. Next to him sat 2 women in identical black polo shirts, looking utterly exhausted. They were the floral assistants, who had likely been on their feet since dawn arranging the centerpieces at the front of the room. And then there was my place setting. It was the seat closest to the kitchen doors, practically sitting in the aisle. Simone had not just excluded me from the family table. She had deliberately placed me with the hired help, positioning me in the most chaotic, undesirable seat in the entire building. It was a calculated, very public statement about exactly where she believed I belonged in the social hierarchy of her new family. The photographer looked up from his camera equipment, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my tailored silver suit and pristine appearance. He looked from me to the cheap banquet chair with a clear expression of confusion. "Are you sure you are at the right table, miss?" he asked politely. "The family tables are all the way up front." I offered him a warm, genuine smile and pulled out my chair. "I am exactly where the bride wanted me," I replied smoothly. And honestly, the company back here seems far more interesting anyway. I took my seat, adjusting my suit jacket. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not storm up to the front of the room to confront my parents, demanding to know why I had been cast aside like an unwanted stranger. That was exactly the reaction Simone was hoping for. She wanted me to cause a scene so she could play the victim and prove to everyone that I was the unstable, jealous sister my parents had always claimed I was. Instead, I sat perfectly still, enveloped in a profound sense of calm. I crossed my legs, rested my purse on the table, and pulled out my cell phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the corner. I opened my messages and pulled up my secure chat with Oliver, the general manager of the Grand Azure. I typed out a message with quick, precise movements. Oliver, I am in the ballroom. Please do not approach my table as I am currently observing the event incognito. However, I need you to access the corporate database immediately. Pull the latest comprehensive vendor audit, specifically the third quarter financial compliance reports for a company called Prime Logistics. Send the entire file to my secure email. I hit send. My parents had made it very clear in the lobby that Trey was marrying into money. They had bragged about Simone's father, Richard, and his massive logistics firm. But when my father said the name of the company, a very specific bell had rung in my memory. Prime Logistics. I recognized the name because they were not just any company. They were a mid-level freight and supply vendor that had recently managed to secure a highly lucrative distribution contract with Apex Hospitality Group. My company. Simone and her family were parading around the room, acting like untouchable royalty. They were treating me like dirt on their expensive shoes, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the phantom chief executive officer who signed the very checks funding this extravagant lifestyle. They were using my money to finance the champagne they drank, the diamonds on Simone's neck, and the ridiculous engagement party meant to humiliate me. My phone buzzed softly in my hand. It was a reply from Oliver. Understood, Ms. Naomi. The files are being compiled now. You will have them in your inbox in less than 5 minutes. Is there anything else you require? I typed back a single word. No. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table next to my water glass. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the massive ballroom. Through the sea of guests, I could see the head table. Simone was laughing, tossing her head back while her father poured her another glass of expensive wine. My parents were smiling brightly, looking more relaxed and proud than I had seen them in decades. They were all playing their parts perfectly in this grand illusion of wealth and superiority. I took a slow sip of my ice water, feeling the cool liquid slide down my throat. Let them laugh. Let them enjoy their prime seating and their false sense of power. The audit was on its way, and I knew for a fact that my compliance team at Apex was notoriously ruthless. If Richard was inflating his wealth to impress my parents, the financial reports would expose every single lie. I sat back and watched the show from the shadows, knowing that with a single tap on my phone screen, I could dismantle their entire empire. Just as my phone vibrated against the table with a new email notification signaling the arrival of the financial audit, the soft jazz music floating through the ballroom abruptly faded into silence. The low hum of conversation slowly died down as the sharp, clear sound of a silver spoon tapping against crystal echoed across the massive room. I looked up toward the front of the venue. Simone was standing at the center of the head table. She held a microphone in one hand and a freshly filled glass of water in the other, bathed in a warm spotlight that the audio-visual team had perfectly angled to catch the heavy diamonds resting against her collarbone. She offered the crowd a dazzling, perfectly practiced smile that looked like it belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight." Simone began, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. Her tone was sugary sweet, carrying that specific cadence of someone who was completely in love with the sound of her own voice. Trey and I are so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by such an amazing network of highly successful, driven, and supportive people. Looking out at this room, I see the merging of two families, but more importantly, I see the merging of two legacies. The crowd offered a polite murmur of agreement. Richard, her father, beamed with pride and patted Trey firmly on the back. My brother just sat there smiling vacantly, looking like a trophy that had just been purchased at a charity auction. We wanted tonight to be flawless, Simone continued, taking a slow, dramatic pause as she let her gaze sweep across the room. We wanted to spare no expense to celebrate this union. But before we begin the dinner service, I actually want to take a special moment to highlight someone who traveled quite a long way to be here. Someone who has always done things her own way. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. I knew exactly where this was going. The photographer sitting next to me at table 24 stopped wiping down his camera lens and looked up, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Simone extended her hand, pointing directly toward the dark, drafty corner of the room, where I was seated with the hired help. Trey has a big sister, Simone announced, her voice dripping with a toxic blend of fake sympathy and undeniable condescension. Naomi lives out in the country. She lives a very simple, quiet life away from the hustle and demands of the corporate world. Now Naomi could not quite afford to purchase a gift from our registry, and we completely understand that times are tough for some people right now. We really do. A heavy, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. 200 wealthy guests turned in their seats, craning their necks to look toward the back of the ballroom, trying to catch a glimpse of the poor, struggling sister hiding in the shadows near the kitchen. I could see my mother bury her face in her hands. My father stared down at his empty plate, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. They were mortified. But Simone said, raising her voice to bring the attention back to her, Naomi still wanted to contribute to our special night. She wanted to prove how much she supports us. So she has generously offered to cover the vintage champagne for the entire room tonight. Let us all give a huge round of applause for Trey's big sister, Naomi. The room erupted into enthusiastic applause. It was the kind of loud, relieved clapping that wealthy people do when they realize they are getting something expensive for free. I sat frozen in my chair. I had never agreed to buy them a single drop of alcohol, let alone cover a champagne toast for an event of this magnitude. Right on cue, the heavy metal swinging doors of the catering kitchen burst open right beside my table. A line of 20 waiters marched out in perfect unison. They were dressed in immaculate white jackets carrying massive silver trays loaded with tall, elegant crystal flutes. But what caught my attention were the bottles resting in the silver ice buckets being rolled out behind them. I recognized the dark green glass and the distinctive gold foil immediately. It was the hotel's reserve vintage. I knew exactly what it was because I had personally negotiated the import contract with the vineyard in France just 3 months ago. The hotel sold that specific vintage to our premium guests for $800 a bottle. I quickly did the mental math. 200 guests meant they needed to pour at least 30 bottles to ensure every glass was filled for the toast, plus the backup bottles required for the head table. 30 bottles at $800 apiece was $24,000. Factoring in the luxury tax and the mandatory 20% gratuity applied to all large events at the Grand Azur, the final bill was going to easily surpass $30,000. I looked back at the head table. Simone was staring right at me, a vicious, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Her strategy was incredibly simple but devastatingly cruel. She had intentionally ordered the most expensive inventory in the building, and she was going to force the venue to drop the check right in my lap in front of 200 people. She was banking on the absolute certainty that a country girl who supposedly lived in a shack would never have a credit card with a $30,000 limit. She wanted to watch my card decline. She wanted to watch me panic cry and beg the management for mercy. Then I knew exactly what would happen next. Her father, Richard, would dramatically pull out his corporate card, pay the bill, and publicly declare that his family was saving the day because Trey's family simply could not afford to run with high society. It was a perfectly laid trap, designed to permanently cement my status as a pathetic failure and elevate her family to the role of wealthy saviors. The photographer next to me let out a low whistle as a waiter walked by with a bottle. "Man," he whispered, leaning toward me. "That is the premium reserve. I shoot weddings here all the time, and I have never seen anyone order this for a crowd this size. You must really love your brother to drop that kind of cash. I did not answer him. I just kept my eyes locked on Simone. My parents were staring at me now, their faces pale with sheer panic. My mother was subtly shaking her head, silently begging me to stand up, confess I did not have the money, and stop the waiters before the corks were popped. They were terrified of the humiliation that was about to rain down on our family name. But I did not stand up. I did not wave my hands to stop the service. Instead, I reached for my glass of ice water. I lifted it into the air, looking directly across the massive ballroom at my future sister-in-law. I offered her a bright, completely unbothered smile, and I tipped my glass toward her in a silent toast. Simone's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. She clearly expected me to be scrambling out of my chair in a blind panic. She did not expect me to comfortably accept the applause. The loud, rhythmic popping of champagne corks began echoing throughout the ballroom. The golden liquid poured into the crystal flutes, bubbling up to the rims. Waiters gracefully moved from table to table, passing out the expensive drinks. I sat back in my cheap banquet chair and watched the entire spectacle unfold with absolute serenity. Let her spring her little trap. Let her order $30,000 worth of champagne. What Simone did not realize was that she was executing her master plan inside my house. She was buying my inventory from my staff on my property. When that astronomical bill finally arrived at my table, I was effectively just moving money from my right pocket into my left. I picked up my phone, unlocked the screen, and opened the secure email containing the financial audit of Prime Logistics. The champagne was flowing. The trap was set, and Simone was convinced she had already won. I began to read the first page of her father's corporate financials. Preparing for the moment, the waiter would finally bring me the check. I did not have to wait long. Less than 10 minutes after the final glass of reserve champagne was poured, I saw Simone lean forward at the head table and give a sharp, authoritative nod to the maitre d'. The man swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the cruel task he had just been assigned. He adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket, picked up a thick black leather check presenter, and began the long walk across the grand ballroom toward my table in the absolute back corner. As he moved, a heavy hush fell over the room once again. 200 pairs of eyes tracked his every step. The guests were sipping their expensive, bubbling drinks, waiting with bated breath for the evening's entertainment to begin. They were waiting for the inevitable public execution of the poor estranged sister. I could feel the collective judgment rolling across the room like a physical wave. My father actually covered his eyes with one hand, unable to watch what he assumed would be the absolute ruin of our family name. The maitre d' arrived at table 24. He looked down at me with genuine pity in his eyes. "Miss," he whispered, keeping his voice as low as possible to spare me what he thought would be unbearable humiliation. I sincerely apologized for the intrusion during the event, but the bride specifically requested that this invoice be settled immediately before the dinner service continues. He gently placed the black leather book on the tablecloth next to my water glass. I smiled at him warmly to reassure him that he was not the villain in this scenario. I flipped the leather cover open. The itemized receipt was printed on thick premium hotel stationery. $32,400. That included the luxury tax and the mandatory 20% gratuity for large events. The event photographer sitting next to me leaned over, caught a quick glimpse of the bolded total at the bottom of the page, and actually choked on a piece of ice from his water glass. He stared at me in absolute horror, waiting for me to burst into tears. I did not gasp. I did not pull out my phone to frantically call my bank and beg for a temporary credit extension. I did not look toward my parents for a bailout. Instead, I calmly reached into my silver designer clutch and pulled out my slim leather card holder. From the center slot, I slid out a solid black metal card. It was entirely unbranded, completely devoid of the typical banking logo's expiration dates or flashy account numbers on the front. It was heavy, sleek, and exclusive, only to individuals maintaining an 8-figure liquid asset portfolio at my particular private bank. I placed the cold metal onto the leather book and handed it back to the maitre d'. He looked down at the card and I watched every single ounce of color drain instantly from his face. His eyes darted from the heavy black metal up to my face, a sudden flash of intense recognition and raw panic flashing in his expression. While the wealthy guests in the room did not know who I was, the senior management and veteran staff at the Grand Azure certainly knew what a top-tier executive ownership card looked like. His hands began to visibly shake. He fumbled slightly as he pulled his secure handheld payment terminal from the pocket of his apron. He inserted the heavy metal chip into the reader. The machine processed the massive transaction in total silence. There was no embarrassing decline beep. There was no flashing red text reading insufficient funds. In less than 3 seconds, the digital screen glowed a bright, cheerful green with a single word: approved. The machine printed a small white slip of paper. I took the elegant silver pen from the leather folio and quickly signed my name. I also added an extra $5,000 tip on the final line, knowing full well that my catering staff was working incredibly hard to deal with my terrible family tonight. I folded the receipt and handed the book back to the man. "Thank you so much," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. "Please make sure the waitstaff gets that extra gratuity. You are all doing a wonderful job tonight." The maitre d' bowed his head so low it was almost a full deferential bow. "Thank you, ma'am." "Immediately, ma'am," he stammered, backing away from my table as if he were suddenly in the presence of royalty. He turned and practically sprinted back toward the safety of the catering kitchen. The guests who had been staring at me from across the room slowly turned back to their own tables, looking visibly confused and profoundly disappointed. There was no dramatic screaming match. There were no pathetic tears. The supposedly broke country girl had just effortlessly absorbed a $30,000 bar tab without breaking a single sweat or altering her posture. I shifted my gaze back to the head table. My mother and father were sitting completely frozen in their high-backed chairs, their mouths slightly open in profound shock. They knew exactly how much money I had begged them for a decade ago to start my life. They had absolutely no mental framework to process what they had just witnessed. But my eyes bypassed my parents entirely and locked directly onto Simone. Simone was gripping the edge of the crisp white tablecloth so tightly that her knuckles had turned an ashen gray. Her smug, triumphant smile had completely vanished, replaced by a look of deep, unsettling confusion and furious disbelief. Her elaborate trap had not just failed. It had backfired spectacularly. By trying to expose my supposed poverty, she had accidentally forced me to flex a level of absolute financial dominance that her own wealthy father would struggle to match on a whim. She glared at me across the room, her chest heaving slightly with barely contained irritation. She had wanted to prove to everyone that I did not belong in her elite, untouchable world. Instead, I had just casually paid for it without blinking an eye. I gave her one final highly polite nod, acknowledging her defeat, and then picked up my cell phone again. The appetizer plates were actively being cleared away by the staff and the main course was about to be served. It was time for the next act of the circus to begin. I knew Simone's father would not be able to handle the sudden shift in the room's energy. He was going to take the stage to try and reclaim the ultimate spotlight, completely unaware that I was currently reading the exact corporate documents that would end his entire career. The quiet murmur in the ballroom had barely resumed when the sharp whine of microphone feedback suddenly pierced the air. I looked up from my phone screen to see that Richard had left his prime seat at the head table. He was now standing center stage, adjusting his expensive silk tie and projecting an aura of absolute unshakable authority. He was a tall, imposing man who wore his wealth like a heavy suit of armor, and it was entirely obvious that he could not stand the shifted energy in the room. His daughter's elaborate trap had just failed spectacularly in front of Seattle's elite, and the supposedly broke country sister had effortlessly absorbed a catastrophic bill. Richard needed to reclaim the narrative. He needed to remind every single person in that room exactly who held the real power. "Can I have everyone's attention for just one more moment?" Richard boomed into the microphone, his deep voice commanding absolute silence. The guests politely put down their silverware and turned their attention back to the stage. My parents leaned forward in their seats, staring up at him with expressions of pure, unadulterated awe. "We are all here tonight to celebrate the beautiful union of Simone and Trey." Richard began offering a practiced, magnanimous smile. "But as any successful person in this room knows, a marriage is not just a romantic union. It is a partnership. It is the merging of two families, two legacies, and two futures." When Trey asked for my daughter's hand, I told him that he was stepping into a family that values ambition, relentless hard work, and corporate excellence above all else. He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air. I took a slow sip of my ice water, watching him pace the stage. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was using his future son-in-law's engagement party as a networking opportunity to stroke his own massive ego. "For the past 20 years, I have poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building Prime Logistics." Richard continued, his voice swelling with immense pride. "Many of you in this room are my investors, my partners, and my friends. You know the sacrifices I have made. And tonight, I am incredibly proud to announce that those sacrifices have finally culminated in a game-changing milestone for our family empire." A wave of anticipatory whispers rippled through the crowd. Richard waited for the dramatic tension to peak before delivering his punchline. "As of this morning, Prime Logistics has officially secured an exclusive multi-million-dollar vendor contract with the most prestigious luxury brand on the entire East Coast," he announced, practically shouting the words into the microphone. "We are now the sole supply chain distributors for Apex Hospitality Group." The ballroom erupted into genuine thunderous applause. Businessmen in tailored suits stood up to clap, while their wives offered approving nods. My father was clapping so hard his face was turning red, entirely desperate to be associated with this level of corporate prestige. Trey sat perfectly straight, puffing his chest out as if he had somehow negotiated the deal himself. I sat frozen in my cheap banquet chair in the dark corner of the room. I had to bite the inside of my cheek hard to stop myself from bursting into loud, uncontrollable laughter. Apex Hospitality Group was not just a corporate giant. It was my parent company. I was the sole founder, the majority shareholder, and the chief executive officer. I had built that entire empire from the ground up, starting with a single undervalued motel I purchased 12 years ago. Today, Apex owned and operated 35 ultra-luxury properties, including the very building Richard was currently standing in. And here he was, puffing his chest out and bragging to 200 people about working for me, completely unaware that he did not even know my face. But Richard was not finished. The applause fueled his arrogance, and he leaned closer to the microphone to embellish his great victory. Securing this contract was no easy feat. Richard lied smoothly, walking back and forth across the stage. Apex is notoriously ruthless. Their vetting process is the most aggressive in the industry. But I had the distinct privilege of sitting down for a private lunch with the founder and chief executive officer just last week. He is a brilliant, highly demanding man. But we shared a very expensive bottle of scotch, looked each other in the eye, and he told me that Prime Logistics was the only company in the country he trusted to handle his delicate supply chain. I raised my eyebrows, staring at him over the rim of my water glass. A private lunch? An expensive bottle of scotch? A brilliant man. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost poetic. Not only had I never met Richard in my entire life, but my acquisitions team handled all mid-level vendor contracts. Prime Logistics was merely a line item on a spreadsheet to me, an outsourced freight company tasked with delivering bulk luxury linens and specialized cleaning supplies to our southeastern properties. Richard had never even made it past my junior compliance officers, let alone into my private executive dining room. I slowly lowered my glass and picked up my cell phone. Oliver had sent the third quarter financial audit right on time. While Richard continued to soak up the adulation of the crowd, spinning fairy tales about his close personal friendship with the Phantom CEO, I opened the secure PDF file and began to scroll through his company's actual performance metrics. The numbers painted a very different picture from the glorious triumph he was currently describing. I read through the data with cold, precise focus. According to my compliance team, Prime Logistics was barely scraping by. Their profit margins were dangerously thin. More importantly, I noticed glaring irregularities in the billing cycles. They had padded their recent invoices by an average of 18%, citing fabricated fuel surcharges and expedited delivery fees that were explicitly prohibited under Section 4 of our Standard Vendor Agreement. Furthermore, their delivery logs showed a consistent pattern of delays disrupting the operational flow of 3 of my boutique hotels in the Carolinas. Richard was not just bragging about a contract he barely managed to secure. He was bragging about a contract he was actively violating to keep his sinking company afloat. He was stealing from me to fund the diamonds around his daughter's neck and the lavish lifestyle he was parading around tonight. "Let us raise a glass," Richard shouted, holding his crystal flute high in the air. "To family, to prosperity, and to the unstoppable future of Prime Logistics." The room echoed with the sound of clinking glasses and enthusiastic cheers. Simone blew her father a kiss from the head table, her confidence entirely restored. My mother wiped a tear of pride from her eye, looking at her son, as if he had just won the lottery by simply existing in the proximity of such immense wealth. Richard handed the microphone back to the event coordinator and stepped down from the stage. He began to slowly work his way through the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, and patting his wealthy friends on the back. But as I watched him move between the tables, I noticed his trajectory. He was not just wandering aimlessly. His eyes were locked on the dark corner near the kitchen doors. He was heading directly toward table 24. He had successfully re-established his dominance over the room, but that was not enough for a man with an ego that fragile. He needed to put the poor estranged sister firmly in her place. He needed to make sure I understood the massive financial gulf that existed between my supposed rural poverty and his incredible corporate success. I locked my phone screen and slipped it quietly back into my silver designer clutch. I folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth and waited. The trap had been reset, but this time I was not the one stepping into it. Richard was walking straight into a corporate minefield, and I was more than ready to watch him detonate his own career. Richard arrived at my table a few moments later, exuding the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive cologne and cheap arrogance. He did not ask for permission to sit. He simply pulled out the empty chair across from me, the cheap metal legs scraping loudly against the floor, and sat down with a heavy sigh. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest as he looked at me with an expression of profound pity. The event photographer sitting next to me immediately stiffened. He quietly gathered his spare camera batteries and slid his chair a few inches away, clearly sensing the sudden drop in temperature at our table. Naomi, Richard began, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial register that was meant to sound sympathetic, but only sounded incredibly condescending. "I wanted to come over here and check on you. I know tonight must be very overwhelming for someone in your position." I kept my hands folded neatly on the table and offered him a polite, entirely hollow smile. "I am doing just fine, Richard. The catering staff is excellent." He waved his hand dismissively, as if my comfort was completely irrelevant. "Listen, your father and I had a long talk about you during the cocktail hour. He told me that things have been a bit tight for you out there in the country. He mentioned that your little business ventures have not quite panned out the way you hoped." I felt a sharp prick of annoyance at the realization that my father was actively discussing my fabricated financial ruin with a man he barely knew, all to make Trey look better by comparison. I did not correct him. I just waited for the inevitable sales pitch I knew was coming. "You are going to be family soon," Richard continued, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "And family takes care of family." Now, with this massive new Apex hospitality contract, Prime Logistics is expanding rapidly. We are opening 3 new distribution warehouses in the tri-state area next month. I need reliable people to manage the inventory floors. It is not glamorous work, and it pays an hourly wage, but it is honest. If you are willing to roll up your sleeves and move back to the city, I can guarantee you a low-level warehouse position. Consider it a favor to your brother. The sheer audacity of the offer hung in the air. He was sitting in a building I owned, offering me a minimum wage job, moving boxes for a company that was currently committing corporate fraud against my own enterprise. That is an incredibly generous offer, Richard, I said smoothly, my voice devoid of any emotion. But I am actually quite satisfied with my current line of work. Richard frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in irritation. His charitable savior complex had just been rejected, and his ego could not handle it. Do not be proud, Naomi. Pride is exactly what keeps people stuck in dead-end lives. You just saw me up on that stage. You heard what I achieved today. I am operating at the absolute highest level of corporate America. I play golf with the chief executive officer of Apex Hospitality Group. He and I are close personal friends. You would be foolish to turn down a direct connection to that kind of power. I tilted my head slightly, feigning a look of innocent curiosity. I decided it was time to test exactly how deep his delusions ran. That is fascinating, I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. Since you and the chief executive are such close personal friends, I am curious how the two of you managed to navigate the hazardous materials addendum in Section 4 of their master service agreement. From what I understand, Apex strictly requires a bonded third-party auditor for all chemical transports to their luxury resorts. Did your buddy waive that requirement for you on the golf course? Richard blinked. His confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly looking like a student who had just been called on to answer a question he had not studied for. Well, he stammered slightly, clearing his throat. My legal team handles the small print, Naomi. When you are at the executive level, you do not bog yourself down with petty operational details. I nodded slowly, acting as if his answer made perfect sense. Of course. Executive privilege. But surely your close friend discussed the fuel surcharge cap with you. Corporate logistics is heavily dependent on fuel rates right now. Apex forbids any vendor from adjusting the base freight rate above a 3% margin without a mandatory quarterly market review. Yet I read recently that companies like yours are struggling with those margins. How did you justify billing an 18% unauthorized surcharge last month without triggering an automatic contract termination? The blood drained from Richard's face. His eyes widened in genuine shock, and his mouth opened and closed silently for a moment. He had absolutely no idea how a random woman sitting in the back corner of an engagement party knew the exact highly classified financial metrics of his fraudulent billing cycle. He stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. I do not know where you are getting your information, little girl. Richard sneered, his voice losing all traces of fake sympathy and dropping into a harsh, defensive growl. But you clearly do not understand how complex multi-million-dollar corporate contracts function. I leaned forward, mirroring his aggressive posture, but my face remained perfectly calm. I understand them perfectly, Richard, which is why I am also incredibly curious about your carbon offset compliance penalties. Apex terminates any vendor that fails to submit their emissions data by the end of the fiscal quarter. Your company completely missed the filing deadline 3 days ago. Are you not terrified that your good friend is going to review the audit tomorrow morning and void your exclusive contract before the ink is even dry? That was the breaking point. The illusion of the sophisticated, wealthy patriarch shattered entirely. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his tight silk collar. He slammed his heavy hand down onto the table, making the silverware rattle and causing the event photographer to physically jump out of his seat. Listen to me, you arrogant, ungrateful brat, Richard, hissed, his voice rising loudly enough to draw the attention of several nearby tables. You sit here in your cheap clothes pretending you know anything about the real world. You are nothing but a pathetic liability to your family. I came over here out of the goodness of my heart to throw you a bone to save you from your miserable failing life out in the woods. And you have the nerve to sit here and interrogate me about my business. Guests at the surrounding tables had stopped eating and were openly staring at us. I could see the alarms spreading across the room. Richard was losing his temper completely, unable to defend his own corporate practices against three simple questions. His loud, aggressive outburst was shattering the high society aesthetic Simone had worked so desperately to cultivate for the evening. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I just stared right back into his furious eyes, letting him drown in his own explosive incompetence. "You did not come over here to help me, Richard," I said quietly, my words cutting through his anger like a scalpel. "You came over here to make yourself feel big, because you know deep down that your company is drowning." Richard pushed his chair back violently, the metal legs shrieking against the floor. He stood up, towering over me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He looked as if he wanted to flip the table over. He opened his mouth to shout another insult to completely lose whatever remaining dignity he had left in front of his wealthy peers. But before he could say another word, a heavy hand grabbed my arm from behind, pulling me forcefully out of my chair. I stumbled slightly, caught off guard by the sudden physical contact. I turned my head to see my brother Trey standing right behind me. His face was twisted in a mask of pure panic and intense rage. He had seen the commotion from the head table and had sprinted across the ballroom to intervene before Richard caused a full-blown scene. Trey's grip on my arm was bruising, and his eyes darted nervously between my calm face and Richard's furious expression. The night was spiraling entirely out of their control, and Trey was about to make the biggest mistake of his life by demanding I take the blame. Trey's grip was tight enough to leave a bruise. He dragged me past the staring faces of the wealthy guests, his fingers digging fiercely into the fine wool of my custom silver suit. I did not struggle. I simply allowed him to pull me toward the heavy oak double doors at the far end of the ballroom. As he shoved the doors open and pulled me into the quiet, dimly lit executive corridor, the lively jazz music and the chaotic hum of the party were instantly severed. The thick imported floral carpet absorbed the sound of our footsteps, creating an eerie, suffocating silence in the hallway. Once we were completely out of sight from the waitstaff and the prying eyes of his future in-laws, Trey finally released my arm. He spun around to face me, his chest heaving. The confident, smug groom who had been sitting at the head table just moments ago was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, sweating man-child whose carefully constructed house of cards had just been violently shaken. "What is wrong with you, Trey?" hissed his voice, echoing sharply off the marble walls. "Are you actively trying to destroy my life tonight? Are you insane?" I maintained my composure. I slowly raised my hand and carefully smoothed out the deep wrinkles his grip had left on my sleeve. I looked at him with absolute detachment. "I was having a quiet, private conversation with your future father-in-law." I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional reaction. He approached my table of his own free will. He initiated the conversation. If a man who claims to be a titan of industry cannot handle a few basic questions about his own corporate compliance, that is his problem. It is certainly not mine. Basic questions. Trey practically screamed, taking an aggressive step toward me. "You were interrogating him. You were trying to make him look stupid in front of half the room. Do you have any idea what you are doing? Richard is not just some random guy, Naomi. He is the founder and president of Prime Logistics. He is my ticket out of this endless cycle of grinding." I stared at him, letting his desperate words hang in the empty hallway. The sheer, pathetic nature of his confession was staggering even for him. "Your ticket out of grinding," I repeated slowly, letting a cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Trey, you have never ground a day in your life. Mom and Dad have funded every single failed business venture you have ever dreamed up since you dropped out of college. From your bankrupt sneaker company to your failed tech startup, they drained their entire retirement savings to ensure you never had to experience the consequences of failure. And now that their bank accounts are completely empty, You have simply found a new host to attach yourself to. Trey's face turned a darker, more volatile shade of red. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You do not know anything about my struggles. You ran away to the country the second things got hard for you. You gave up on this family. But I stayed here. I networked. I put in the hours. And Richard has promised me a vice president title at his company. Do you understand what that actually means? I get a corner office. I get a base salary of $250,000 a year. I get full executive health care and a company car. And I do not have to start at the bottom and work my way up like some nobody. I am finally getting what I deserve. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Suddenly, every single piece of this elaborate puzzle snapped perfectly into place. This grand engagement party, the forced smiles, the desperate need for aesthetic perfection. It was not about love. It was not about building a life with a partner. It was a calculated, parasitic transaction. Trey was marrying Simone purely to leech off Richard's supposed wealth, completing the 20-year cycle of his lazy entitlement. Simone wanted a handsome, compliant husband she could show off to her high society friends like a designer handbag. In exchange, Trey wanted a permanent financial bailout without ever having to put in a single day of actual hard labor. It was a marriage of ultimate convenience built entirely on a foundation of greed, mutual exploitation, and profound laziness. So you are selling yourself, I stated flatly, looking at him with undisguised pity. You are marrying a woman who treats people like absolute garbage, all so her father can hand you a fake executive title at a company you know absolutely nothing about. It is not a fake title. Trey snapped his hands, balling into tight fists at his sides. It is my right. I deserve a position that matches my true potential. And Richard is the only one who sees that potential. But he is furious right now, Naomi. You humiliated him in front of his primary investors. He just pulled me aside and told me that if you do not walk back into that ballroom right now and apologize to him in front of everyone, he is going to rethink my position at the company. I let out a short, cold laugh. The sound seemed to startle him, breaking through his frantic demands. You want me to walk into a room of 200 people and apologize to a man who just offered me a minimum wage warehouse job in a deliberate attempt to humiliate me? You want me to beg for his forgiveness so you can secure a fake corporate job? Yes, Trey demanded, his eyes wide with frantic desperation. Because he is rich, Naomi. He has real power and real influence. You live in a dilapidated shack upstate. You do not understand how the corporate world works. You have to swallow your pride and do this for me. I am your brother. You owe me this. I owe you absolutely nothing, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. And let me make something very clear to you right now, Trey. You dragged me out here to scream at me, but you did not even mention the $32,000 champagne bill I just paid. I absorbed that massive cost without a single complaint to save your precious bride from making a fool of herself when her little trap failed. I paid it to spare our parents the public humiliation of watching you beg the venue for a payment plan. But asking me to lower myself and apologize to a fraudulent, arrogant bully, just so you can avoid getting a real job, is where I draw the absolute line. Fraudulent Trey scoffed loudly, throwing his hands in the air in exasperation. You are insane. Prime Logistics just landed the biggest vendor contract in their entire history. They are untouchable. Prime Logistics is actively drowning, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Richard is illegally padding his invoices to keep his head above water. He is violating federal compliance laws and breaching his core vendor agreements. His profit margins are a complete joke. You are tying your entire future to a sinking ship, Trey. And when that company eventually goes under, your little vice president title will not be worth the expensive paper it is printed on. Trey stared at me, his chest heaving with exertion. He clearly did not believe a single word I was saying. To him, I was just the jealous, bitter older sister trying to ruin his ultimate moment of triumph. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust washing over his features. You are just jealous. He spat, his voice dripping with venom. You have always been jealous of me because Mom and Dad loved me more. Because I am succeeding where you failed. You are a pathetic, lonely woman, Naomi. If you do not walk back in there and apologize to Richard right now, I will personally have the hotel security throw you out of my party. I will cut you out of my life forever. I looked at the terrified, entitled boy, wearing a man's custom tuxedo. There was no love left in my heart for him. There was no sibling loyalty. There was only the cold, sharp clarity of a business executive recognizing a terrible investment and cutting her losses. Do not threaten me with a good time, Trey, I said softly, my face completely expressionless. I am not apologizing to anyone. If you want to tie your entire life to a man who is actively committing corporate fraud, be my guest. But do not expect me to fall on my sword to protect your fragile ego. I turned my back on him, calmly adjusting the collar of my silver suit. I did not wait for his response. I began walking down the opulent corridor, leaving him standing there fuming in the suffocating silence, hopelessly trapped in a web of lies he was far too blind to see. I stepped back into the grand ballroom, leaving the suffocating silence of the executive hallway behind me. The vibrant energy of the room had shifted once again. The catering staff was quietly clearing the final dessert plates, and the attention of the 200 guests had been directed toward the center of the massive dance floor. A velvet chair had been placed directly under a spotlight, and a towering table stacked high with impeccably wrapped boxes and oversized envelopes sat beside it. Simone was perched on the velvet chair holding a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. It was time for the public gift opening. To any rational person, opening gifts in front of a massive audience of corporate investors and distant relatives was incredibly tacky, a blatant display of materialism. But for Simone, it was the main event. It was her opportunity to publicly tally her new net worth and parade her high society connections. I made my way back to table 24, taking my seat next to the event photographer, who gave me a cautious, sympathetic nod. I smoothed my skirt and turned my attention to the stage, watching Simone tear into the expensive wrapping paper with theatrical enthusiasm. She gushed over a crystal decanter from a bank executive. She practically squealed over a pair of designer watches from one of her father's investors. Every gift was announced to the room, accompanied by the approximate retail value heavily implied in her tone of voice. Trey eventually walked back into the ballroom, taking a seat near the stage. He looked pale and slightly shaken from our confrontation in the hallway, but he quickly plastered on a fake smile for the cameras. Then Simone reached for a sleek, unmarked silver envelope resting near the edge of the table. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope. I had personally commissioned my legal team to draft the documents enclosed within it just 2 weeks ago. Simone slid her manicured finger under the flap and ripped it open. She pulled out a heavy piece of folded ivory cardstock and a single polished silver key that fell softly into the palm of her hand. A confused frown briefly crossed her face as she looked at the key, and then she opened the cardstock to read the handwritten note inside. I watched her eyes scan the elegant cursive handwriting. I saw the exact moment her brain processed the information, and I saw how she instantly twisted it to fit her own toxic narrative. Instead of reading the actual legal document attached to the back of the card, her ego completely took over. A cruel, mocking smirk spread across her face. She lifted the microphone to her lips, holding the small silver key up so the spotlight caught its reflection. Well, everyone, Simone announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that thinly veiled her malicious intent. It looks like we have a very special rustic gift from Trey's big sister Naomi. She has given us a key. A few polite murmurs rippled through the crowd. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats at the front table. Simone let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed loudly through the sound system. She wrote a lovely note offering us a place to stay if we ever need to get away from the city. A key to your little country shack, Naomi. That is so incredibly quaint. But considering my father just secured the Apex Logistics contract, I think Trey and I will be spending our vacations in Paris and Milan, not swatting mosquitoes in a drafty cabin upstate. So respectfully hard pass. Without a second thought, Simone dramatically tossed the silver key and the heavy ivory cardstock over her shoulder. The items sailed through the air and landed with a soft thud directly into a decorative wicker trash bin that the catering staff was using to collect discarded wrapping paper and ribbons. A chorus of mean-spirited laughter erupted from the tables near the front, led primarily by Simone's wealthy friends and her arrogant father Richard. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, looking absolutely mortified by the public rejection, while Trey simply stared at his shoes, refusing to make eye contact with me. They were laughing at the poor, pathetic sister and her worthless rural offering. I sat perfectly still in the dark corner of the ballroom. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the wicker trash bin sitting near the edge of the dance floor. It was not a key to a country shack. It was not a guest house on my upstate property. That silver key unlocked the door to a sprawling 3-bedroom luxury penthouse condo situated in the absolute heart of downtown Atlanta. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows, a private rooftop terrace, and a state-of-the-art security system. More importantly, the heavy ivory cardstock Simone had just tossed into the garbage without bothering to read was the official deed to the property. I had purchased the condo in cash for $1.2 million, and I had already paid the property taxes for the next 5 years. I did not buy it because I loved Simone. I bought it because I am a brilliant businesswoman who knows how to spot a terrible investment. I knew Trey was chronically irresponsible with money. I knew Richard's company was actively committing fraud and would eventually collapse under the weight of my corporate compliance audits. I knew that within a year this newlywed couple was going to be completely bankrupt, facing massive debt, and begging my parents to let them sleep on their couch. The $1 million condo was a calculated safety net. It was my way of ensuring my brother would not drag my aging parents down into financial ruin when his house of cards finally collapsed. But Simone had just thrown a $1.2 million lifeline directly into the garbage. The laughter in the room began to die down as the guests waited for my reaction. They expected me to run out of the ballroom in tears. They expected me to be thoroughly crushed by the public humiliation. Instead, I calmly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my tailored suit, lifted my chin, and walked slowly and deliberately across the massive ballroom. The room went completely silent. 200 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement. The rhythmic clicking of my designer heels against the polished marble floor was the only sound echoing in the massive space. I walked right past the head table. I walked right past Trey, who looked like he might actually be sick. I stopped right in front of the velvet chair where Simone was sitting with a smug, victorious smile on her face. I did not look at her. I did not say a single word. I simply bent down, reached into the decorative wicker trash bin, and pulled out the ivory cardstock and the silver key. I brushed a stray piece of crumpled wrapping paper off the document. I folded the deed neatly, slid it into my clutch, and snapped the silver clasp shut. I looked up and met Simone's eyes. Her smug smile faltered slightly under the absolute coldness of my stare. She had no idea that she had just permanently evicted herself from $1 million safety net. She had no idea that she was entirely on her own now. I turned on my heel and began the long walk back to my seat in the dark corner of the room, leaving the bride completely speechless and the crowd drowning in a tense, confused silence. The safety net was officially revoked. The gloves were completely off, and Simone was about to push her luck one step too far. The jazz quartet desperately tried to smooth over the awkwardness by playing a lively tune, but the heavy, uncomfortable murmur had already spread across the ballroom. The public gift opening had come to a grinding, confusing halt. From my vantage point in the shadows at table 24, I watched Simone. The bright spotlight above her velvet chair suddenly seemed harsh and incredibly unflattering. She was gripping her microphone so tightly her knuckles were white. Her grand moment of public humiliation had fizzled into a silent, baffling retreat on my end, and her massive ego was visibly bruising in real time. She handed the microphone to a bridesmaid and stepped off the stage. She did not go to Trey. She did not go back to her father at the head table. Instead, she flagged down a passing waiter and snatched a full glass of dark Cabernet from his silver tray. I tracked her movements as she began to navigate through the sea of round tables. She was marching with intense purpose, her white designer gown trailing behind her like a storm cloud. She was heading straight for the back corner of the room. Straight for me. The event photographer sitting next to me noticed her aggressive approach. He quickly pulled his expensive camera equipment off the table and set it safely on the floor, clearly anticipating a disaster. Simone arrived at my table with a terrifyingly fake smile plastered across her face. She stopped right next to my chair, looking down at me with eyes that were completely devoid of warmth or sanity. "I just wanted to come over and personally thank you for being here tonight," Naomi Simone said loudly, ensuring that the guests at the surrounding tables could hear her sweet, innocent tone. "I know you do not get out much, and it means the absolute world to Trey that you made the effort to dress up for us." Before I could even offer a polite, indifferent response, Simone shifted her weight. She did not trip. She did not stumble on the hem of her gown. With a swift, deliberate flick of her wrist, she tilted the heavy crystal wine glass directly over my lap. A torrent of dark crimson liquid splashed violently across the front of my bespoke silver suit. The Cabernet soaked instantly into the premium wool, spreading like a massive jagged wound across my chest and down my right leg. The cold wetness seeped through the silk lining, chilling my skin. The sharp, acidic smell of alcohol filled the air between us. "Oh my goodness!" Simone gasped dramatically, pressing her empty hand against her chest in a theatrical display of shock. "I am so incredibly clumsy. I must have caught my heel on the edge of the carpet. I am so sorry, Naomi." She was not sorry. There was a vicious, triumphant gleam in her dark eyes. She had ruined a $3,000 custom suit and she was thrilling in the destruction. She thought she had finally found a way to crack my calm facade. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to lunge at her so she could play the victimized bride in front of 200 wealthy guests and have her father's security throw me out. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the dark red stain ruining my jacket. The sheer pettiness of the act was almost difficult to comprehend. I was the chief executive officer of a massive hospitality empire. I handled multi-million-dollar acquisitions and hostile corporate takeovers before breakfast. And here I was having cheap wine deliberately poured on me by a woman throwing a temper tantrum because she did not get the reaction she wanted from a rejected gift. Before I could stand up to excuse myself, frantic footsteps approached our table. I looked up, expecting a waiter rushing over with a club soda and a towel. Instead, I saw my mother, Brenda. She pushed her way past a group of staring guests, her face flushed with extreme anxiety. For one brief, fleeting second, the little girl buried deep inside me thought my mother was actually coming to protect me. I thought she had seen the blatant, deliberate motion of Simone tipping the glass. I thought she was finally going to defend her daughter against an unprovoked physical attack. I was entirely wrong. My mother did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer me a napkin. She did not turn to Simone and demand an explanation. Instead, she leaned down, grabbed my wine-soaked arm, and glared at me with pure, unadulterated anger. "Why did you wear silver to an engagement party anyway?" My mother hissed, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper that cut straight to my core. "You know Simone is wearing white. You are always trying to upstage her. You deliberately wore a bright color to draw attention to yourself, and look what happened. You made her nervous and she tripped." The entire ballroom seemed to grind to a sudden halt. The jazz music faded into meaningless background noise. The clinking of silverware vanished. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears as I stared at the woman who had given birth to me. The gaslighting was so absolute, so breathtakingly blatant, that it actually knocked the breath out of my lungs. My mother had just watched a grown woman deliberately pour a glass of red wine onto my chest, and her immediate instinctual reaction was to blame me for wearing the wrong color. In her desperate bid to secure a wealthy future for her lazy son, she was willing to completely abandon reality. She was willing to sacrifice my dignity and my reality on the altar of Simone's fragile ego. Naomi, do not just sit there looking like a victim. My mother continued, her grip tightening on my ruined sleeve. Go to the bathroom and clean yourself up before Richard sees you looking like a disaster. You are embarrassing your brother on the most important night of his life. A profound, irreversible shift occurred inside me at that exact moment. For years, I had maintained a quiet distance from my family. I had absorbed their insults, deflected their cruelty, and protected my peace by simply refusing to engage in their toxic drama. I had even bought them $1 million condo to ensure they would not end up on the streets when their terrible decisions caught up with them. I had operated from a place of pity and lingering familial obligation. But as I looked at my mother's furious, blaming face, that obligation evaporated entirely. The last remaining thread connecting me to this family snapped clean in half. There was no more pity. There was no more quiet endurance. I slowly peeled my mother's hand off my arm. I did it with such cold, deliberate force that she actually took a physical step back, her eyes widening in sudden surprise. I stood up from the table. At 5 feet 10 inches in my heels, I towered over both my mother and my future sister-in-law. I looked at Simone, who was suddenly gripping her empty wine glass like a shield, realizing that the dynamic had just violently shifted. I did not look like a humiliated victim. I looked like an apex predator who had just decided to stop playing with her food. You are absolutely right, Mother, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, even register that carried no warmth whatsoever. I should go clean up. And Simone, do not worry about the suit. I promise you by the end of tonight, a spilled glass of wine is going to be the absolute least of your problems. I picked up my silver clutch, turned my back on both of them, and began walking toward the grand hallway that led to the executive restrooms. I was done blending in. I was done playing the quiet, misunderstood sister. They had brought their petty, mean girl tactics to a corporate battlefield, and I was about to show them exactly how a chief executive officer handles a hostile threat. The gloves were officially off. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the executive restroom, the thick carpeting giving way to the cool, imported Italian marble of the floor. The space was completely empty, a quiet sanctuary, away from the suffocating tension of the grand ballroom. I walked over to the long vanity, looking at my reflection in the massive mirror, framed by brushed gold fixtures. The red wine stain was a glaring, jagged disaster across the front of my tailored silver suit. It had already soaked deep into the premium wool, effectively ruining a $3,000 garment. I turned on the brass faucet, letting the warm water run over a thick cotton hand towel that I had personally selected for all the executive suites in my hotel chain. I began dabbing at the dark crimson stain, my movements slow and deliberate. I was not upset about the suit. Clothes could be replaced. I was utilizing the quiet moment to process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of my mother and my future sister-in-law. Just as I tossed the ruined white towel into the brass wastebasket, the heavy wooden door of the restroom swung open. I watched in the mirror as Simone stepped inside. She did not look frantic or apologetic. She reached behind her, grabbed the solid brass deadbolt, and turned it. The heavy click of the lock echoed sharply against the marble walls, sealing us inside the room together. Simone dropped the sweet, victimized bride persona the second the lock clicked into place. The innocent, wide-eyed look she had weaponized in the ballroom vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating glare that revealed exactly who she really was. She crossed her arms over the bodice of her expensive white gown and stared at me with absolute entitlement. "Let us drop the act." Naomi Simone said, her voice completely devoid of the sugary southern drawl she had been using all night. Her tone was flat, demanding, and sharp as broken glass. "I do not know how you managed to pay that bar tab tonight. Maybe you took out a second mortgage on your little cabin, or maybe you drained your entire life savings just to look impressive and spite me. I really do not care. What I do care about is the fact that you have a pristine credit score, and I need to use it." I turned off the water. I slowly turned around to face her, leaning my lower back against the marble vanity. I did not say a word. I just let her dig her own grave. Trey and I found a house. Simone continued taking a few steps closer to me, her designer heels clicking sharply on the tile. It is a stunning 6-bedroom estate in Buckhead. It is exactly the kind of property we need to entertain my father's corporate clients and establish our footing in Atlanta high society. The problem is, Trey has the credit score of a bankrupt college student because your parents let him run wild without any financial discipline. He cannot even get approved for a basic car loan, let alone a luxury mortgage. I stared at her, genuinely fascinated by the psychological gymnastics happening in her brain. She had just publicly humiliated me, deliberately poured a glass of Cabernet down my chest, and now she was cornering me in a locked bathroom to demand a financial favor. "And your wealthy, successful father cannot simply buy the house for you?" I asked, keeping my voice mild and conversational, though I already knew the answer. According to the audit sitting in my inbox, Richard was drowning in debt. Simone waved her hand dismissively, masking the truth with corporate buzzwords. My father has all his capital tied up in the new Apex Logistics expansion. He is liquidating assets to build the new warehouses. He cannot take on a massive personal liability right now. So that leaves you. She took another step forward, closing the distance between us until she was standing only a few feet away. "I need a co-signer," Naomi Simone demanded, looking me dead in the eye. "The mortgage is $1.5 million. I know you live off the grid like a hermit, which means you have zero debt-to-income ratio and a completely clean financial record. The bank will approve the loan instantly with your signature on the guarantor line. I have the digital paperwork ready to be sent to your email right now." I let out a slow, quiet breath. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was almost impressive. She genuinely believed she held all the power in this dynamic. She viewed me as nothing more than a useful tool, an emergency financial resource she could bully into submission to fund a lifestyle neither she nor my brother could actually afford. "Let me make sure I understand this perfectly," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You tossed the deed to a fully paid-off $1 million condo into a garbage can in front of 200 people because it was not good enough for you. Then you intentionally ruined my clothes, and now you have locked me in a bathroom to demand that I legally bind myself to a $1.5 million debt for a house I will never live in." Simone narrowed her eyes, her jaw setting in a stubborn, aggressive line. "You owe this to your brother. You abandoned him. You abandoned your entire family to go live in the woods and play the independent victim. Trey has suffered because of your selfishness. This is your chance to finally make things right and actually contribute to this family." I did not break eye contact. "I owe Trey nothing," I replied coldly. "And I certainly do not owe you a single cent. I will never sign those papers, Simone. You and Trey will have to figure out how to finance your own delusions of grandeur." Simone's face hardened. The mask of the demanding bride slipped, revealing a ruthless, vindictive bully who was completely accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted through intimidation. "You listen to me very carefully," Simone hissed, taking one final step forward, so she was entirely in my personal space. "You are going to sign those mortgage papers by Monday morning. If you refuse, I will make sure you are completely dead to this family. I will have security ban you from our wedding. I will make sure you are never invited to another Thanksgiving, Christmas, or family dinner as long as you live." She reached out and actually poked her manicured index finger hard against my shoulder, a physical breach of my boundaries that sent a jolt of icy adrenaline straight through my veins. "And when Trey and I have children," Simone threatened, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper, "I promise you that you will never meet them. You will never see your nieces or nephews. You will die alone in that pathetic little country house, completely forgotten by the only people who ever tolerated you. I am the gatekeeper to your brother now, Naomi. I control him, and by extension, I control your access to this family. You either use your clean credit to give me the house I want, or I will erase you from our lives completely." The threat hung heavily in the sterile, perfumed air of the restroom. She thought she was delivering a crushing ultimatum, She thought the threat of being cut off from my toxic parents and my parasitic brother would bring me to my knees in tears. She assumed my deepest fear was isolation. What Simone completely failed to realize was that I had already built a beautiful, fulfilling life entirely without them. She was not threatening me with a punishment. She was offering me the exact freedom I had been quietly craving for the last decade. I maintained unblinking eye contact with Simone as her empty threats hung in the air. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the bathroom highlighted the sheer desperation masking itself as power on her face. She truly believed that leveraging the concept of family, the very same concept that had been used as a weapon against me for decades, would somehow force me to submit to her demands. She thought the fear of being uninvited to a wedding I barely wanted to attend, or being kept away from children who did not yet exist, would be enough to extort a $1.5 million signature from me. I reached for another clean towel and slowly dried my hands completely, ignoring the finger she was still pointing at my chest. I tossed the damp towel into the brass bin and finally broke the silence. "I am not funding a lifestyle you cannot afford, Simone," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with absolute finality. "If you want a 6-bedroom estate in Buckhead, I suggest you get a job that pays well enough to afford the mortgage. Or better yet, ask your father to use the money he is illegally siphoning from my parent company to buy it for you. Either way, my signature is never going on those documents." Simone's jaw dropped. The reality that I was completely immune to her manipulation finally seemed to register. Her meticulously planned extortion attempt had failed just as spectacularly as her champagne trap. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, Simone's expression twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "You think you are so much better than us?" she practically growled, her voice shaking with rage. "You are just a pathetic, lonely spinster trying to ruin Trey's happiness, because you are miserable." I did not respond to the insult. I simply reached over, turned the heavy brass deadbolt, and pushed the bathroom door open. "The conversation is over," I said, gesturing toward the exit. "Go back to your party, Simone." For a split second, I thought she might actually strike me. She stood there, her hands balled into tight fists, her chest heaving as she glared at me. Then a terrifyingly calculated look flashed across her eyes. If she could not bully me in private, she was going to destroy me in public. Before I could even register what she was doing, Simone let out a high-pitched theatrical shriek that echoed off the marble walls. It was a piercing, blood-curdling sound designed to mimic absolute terror. She reached up with both hands and violently messed up her own perfectly styled hair, tearing several jeweled pins out and letting them clatter to the floor. She grabbed the neckline of her white designer gown and gave it a sharp tug, ripping a small seam near the collarbone to make herself look disheveled. "Get away from me!" Simone screamed at the top of her lungs, backing toward the open door. "Somebody help me!" She turned and sprinted out of the bathroom, bursting into the grand hallway and continuing her performance as she ran toward the main ballroom. Her fake, agonizing sobs echoed down the corridor. I stood in the doorway watching her go, completely stunned by the sheer level of sociopathic commitment she possessed. She was willing to completely humiliate herself and ruin her own engagement party just to maintain control of the narrative. I took a deep breath, adjusted my ruined silver suit, and followed her out into the hallway. By the time I reached the arched entrance of the ballroom, the entire party had ground to a devastating halt. The jazz band had stopped playing mid-song. The catering staff stood frozen with their silver trays halfway in the air. 200 guests were staring in absolute horror at the center of the dance floor. Simone was collapsed in Trey's arms, weeping hysterically. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she was clutching the slightly torn neckline of her dress as if she had just narrowly escaped a violent assault. "She attacked me," Simone wailed loudly, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at me as I walked into the room. "She locked me in the bathroom and threatened me. She said she was going to ruin the wedding because she hates me." The collective gasp from the room was deafening. The guests turned to stare at me, their faces twisted with a mixture of shock, disgust, and profound judgment. I was standing there with a massive red wine stain across my chest, looking every bit the part of the unhinged, violent sister Simone was accusing me of being. Trey held Simone tightly against his chest, glaring at me with a level of hatred I had never seen from him before. He did not bother to ask for my side of the story. He did not care about the truth. He only cared about protecting the fragile illusion of his perfect, wealthy bride. "Are you out of your mind?" Trey yelled across the silent ballroom, his voice cracking with rage. "You physically attacked my fiancé. My parents were on their feet instantly. My mother looked as if she were about to faint, clutching my father's arm for support. They were completely paralyzed by the public spectacle, unable to comprehend the disaster unfolding in front of their wealthy peers. I did not attack anyone," I said, keeping my voice loud, clear, and perfectly steady so the entire room could hear me. She locked the door, demanded I co-sign a $1.5 million mortgage for a house neither of you can afford, and when I refused, she threw a temper tantrum and messed up her own dress. Liar. Richard's voice boomed from the head table. He stood up, his face purple with absolute rage. He stormed down from the elevated platform, looking like an enraged bull ready to charge. He marched across the dance floor and positioned himself firmly between me and his weeping daughter, acting as her valiant protector against the deranged rural sister. "You listen to me, you violent, jealous psycho!" Richard spat, jabbing a thick finger in my direction. "You have done nothing but disrespect my family since the moment you walked through those doors. You insulted me, you embarrassed your parents, and now you have physically assaulted my daughter." I did not flinch. I did not take a step back. I looked Richard right in the eye, noticing the slight tremor in his hand that betrayed his own mounting anxiety. He was using this manufactured crisis to completely obliterate me, hoping to salvage whatever dignity he had lost during our brief conversation at table 24. "She asked for a mortgage signature," Richard repeated calmly. "Maybe you should ask yourself why your daughter is begging her future sister-in-law for $1 million loan instead of relying on the massive wealth you were just bragging about on that stage." The comment landed exactly where I intended. The guests exchanged confused, whispering glances. The idea that the wealthy heiress of prime logistics was secretly begging for a mortgage cosigner completely shattered the illusion of limitless wealth Richard had spent the entire evening constructing. Richard's face contorted with panic. He realized he was losing control of the room again, and he resorted to the only tactic he had left. He decided to use the ultimate trump card of the wealthy elite. He decided to throw me out. The collective shock in the room quickly morphed into a heavy, aggressive hostility. Richard, sensing that he finally had a captive audience and a clear villain to unite them against, decided to fully commit to his role as the wealthy patriarch protecting his flock from an unhinged outsider. He puffed his chest out, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a sharp, violent tug. He marched right to the edge of the dance floor, making sure every single person in the massive ballroom was hanging on his every word. This is exactly what happens when you let classless ghetto elements into a high society establishment. Richard boomed, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted gold leaf ceilings. He swept his arm toward me in a grand gesture of absolute disgust. "You come in here with your cheap clothes and your bitter jealousy, trying to drag successful people down to your miserable level. You cannot stand to see my daughter thrive, so you resort to violence and intimidation like a common street thug." The crowd began to mutter in immediate agreement. Wealthy investors shook their heads, casting disdainful, judgmental glares in my direction. The wives of corporate executives pulled their designer shawls tighter around their shoulders, looking at me as if I were carrying a contagious disease. My mother Brenda buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly into my father's shoulder, completely devastated by the public spectacle. Trey stood dutifully beside Richard, nodding along with every vicious insult hurled my way. They were entirely united in their hatred of me, completely blinded by the false narrative Richard was spinning. But Richard was not finished. He needed to assert his ultimate dominance. He needed to prove that he held the power of eviction. I am not going to let this deranged woman ruin my daughter's engagement, Richard announced to the room, his voice dripping with false authority and unearned confidence. As I mentioned to all of you earlier tonight, I am close personal friends with the anonymous owner of the Grand Azure. We do multi-million-dollar business together. He respects my company, and I know for an absolute fact that he does not tolerate this kind of trash loitering on his luxury property. I am going to have her permanently removed right now. Richard turned sharply on his heel and snapped his fingers aggressively at a passing concierge who had been frozen in terror near the kitchen doors. The young man jumped, his eyes wide with panic as the angry billionaire directed his wrath toward him. "Fetch the general manager and your top security detail immediately," Richard barked, pointing a thick, shaking finger at the polished marble floor. "Tell them Richard from Prime Logistics requires their immediate assistance to remove a hostile trespasser. Tell them to bring handcuffs if they have to." The concierge offered a quick, terrified nod, nearly dropping his silver tray before sprinting out of the ballroom and down the main corridor. As the room settled into a tense, suffocating wait for the authorities to arrive, the heavy silence returned, broken only by Simone's occasional theatrical sniffles. That was when my father finally stepped away from my weeping mother. David walked slowly across the dance floor, his shoulders completely slumped. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. He navigated through the sea of staring guests, keeping his head down until he stopped just a few feet away from me. I looked at his face, expecting to see a shred of paternal protection. I expected him to finally realize that his daughter had just been verbally abused and physically assaulted with a glass of wine in front of 200 people. Instead, I saw only deep, selfish desperation. "Naomi, please," my father whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic kind of urgency. "Just leave. Please just turn around and go out through the kitchen doors. Sneak out the back alley before the security guards get here. If they drag you out of this ballroom in handcuffs, Trey's reputation in this city will be ruined forever. His future father-in-law will never forgive us. Do not do this to your brother. Just walk away quietly, and we can forget this ever happened." I looked at the man who had raised me. I looked at the man who had consistently chosen my brother's comfort over my basic human dignity for my entire life. He was not worried about my physical safety. He did not care that I was standing there in a ruined $3,000 suit dripping with sticky Cabernet. He only cared about the optics. He wanted me to scurry out the back door like a criminal so his golden child could continue playing pretend with a family of corporate frauds. I reached up and calmly wiped a fresh drop of wine off my silver lapel, feeling the damp wool beneath my fingers. I did not turn toward the kitchen doors. I did not lower my head in shame to grant him the quiet submission he was begging for. Instead, I walked right back to table 24. The event photographer quickly pulled his legs out of the way as I approached. I pulled out my cheap banquet chair, sat down comfortably, and crossed my legs. I folded my hands perfectly in my lap, sitting with the absolute perfect posture of a corporate executive holding court in her own boardroom. I looked past my father, ignoring his pleading eyes completely, and locked my gaze directly onto Richard. I projected my voice so it carried clearly across the dead-silent room, bouncing off the walls so every single guest could hear my final answer. "I am not going anywhere," I said smoothly, my tone completely devoid of fear. "Call them." The sheer, unapologetic defiance in my voice sent a physical shockwave through the room. Several guests actually gasped out loud. Richard's face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of purple. He took a furious step toward me, his hands balled into massive fists, opening his mouth to shout another string of violent threats. But before he could utter a single word, the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a loud, authoritative thud. Everyone in the room snapped their heads toward the entrance. Oliver, the impeccably dressed general manager of the Grand Azure, strode into the room. His posture was perfectly straight, his tailored navy suit completely flawless. He moved with the quiet, terrifying grace of a man who held absolute control over his environment. He was flanked by two massive security guards dressed in sharp, black tactical uniforms. The guards looked incredibly intimidating, their expressions entirely stoic, their hands resting neutrally near the heavy radios clipped to their belts. The tension in the ballroom instantly skyrocketed to a boiling point. The cavalry had finally arrived, and the wealthy guests eagerly leaned forward in their seats, practically holding their breath as they prepared to watch the dramatic, forceful eviction of the classless sister. As soon as Oliver crossed the threshold and stepped onto the expensive carpeting, Simone broke away from Trey's arms. She practically ran across the room to intercept the general manager before he could even assess the situation. The fake theatrical tears magically stopped flowing. The second she reached him, replaced by a vicious, commanding entitlement that she wore like a crown. "Thank goodness you are finally here," Simone demanded, her voice shrill and echoing loudly. She spun around and pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes blazing with malice. "This woman is aggressively harassing me. She cornered me in the restroom, physically threatened me, and now she is refusing to leave my engagement party." Oliver came to a complete halt near the edge of the dance floor, his face completely unreadable. The two massive security guards stopped right behind him, standing at perfect attention. "I demand that you remove her from the premises immediately," Simone ordered, crossing her arms over her chest and looking at Oliver as if he were her personal servant. "My father is Richard, the president of Prime Logistics. He is your top vendor, and he is a very close personal friend of the owner of this hotel. If you do not drag that woman out of here right now, my father will make sure you are fired by tomorrow morning." Simone's shrill voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings and slowly faded into the thick velvet drapes. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the ballroom. It was the kind of absolute quiet that only happens when hundreds of people collectively hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The wealthy guests leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between the towering security guards and my completely unfazed posture at table 24. Richard crossed his arms over his massive chest, a smug, victorious sneer pulling at his lips. He was thoroughly convinced that his name drop had sealed my fate. He stood tall, waiting for the general manager to grovel at his feet, apologize for the disturbance, and forcefully drag the rogue sister out into the cold night air. My parents refused to look at me, staring firmly at the polished marble floor, preemptively mourning the utter destruction of our family's social standing. Trey had his arm wrapped tightly around Simone, kissing the top of her head in a performative display of comfort, while she continued to sniffle dramatically into his shoulder. Everyone was waiting for the final act of my public humiliation. Oliver stood perfectly still near the edge of the dance floor. He was a veteran of the luxury hospitality industry, a man I had personally poached from a competing five-star resort in Geneva because of his legendary composure and razor-sharp instincts. He did not flinch at Simone's screaming. He did not cower at Richard's aggressive posturing. Oliver slowly turned his head to look at Simone. His expression was a masterclass in professional detachment. He took in her deliberately torn designer dress, her messy hair, and the fake tear-streaked makeup running down her cheeks. He processed her furious demand to have me thrown out. He registered her arrogant threat to have him fired by tomorrow morning. Then Oliver shifted his pristine gaze to Richard. He looked at the man who had just publicly claimed to be close personal friends with the anonymous owner of the Grand Azure. He looked at the man who was currently inflating his own corporate importance to bully a woman he believed was entirely defenseless. I could see the faint, almost imperceptible tightening of Oliver's jaw. As the general manager, he had full access to the corporate vendor files. He knew exactly who Prime Logistics was. He knew they were a mid-level freight company currently under strict investigation by my compliance team, and most importantly, he knew exactly who owned the ground Richard was currently standing on. The silence stretched on, becoming thick and unbearable. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The anticipated physical altercation was simply not happening. The grand eviction was stalling, and the wealthy crowd did not understand why. Richard let out a loud, impatient huff. "Well, what are you waiting for?" he barked, gesturing angrily toward me. "Did you not hear my daughter? I said I want this woman removed from the premises. Grab her and get her out of my sight before I call the owner myself and have your entire executive management team replaced." The two massive security guards standing behind Oliver did not even blink. They did not reach for their radios. They did not take a single step in my direction. They stood with their hands clasped firmly behind their backs, their eyes fixed straight ahead, resembling absolute stone statues. They were my personal corporate security detail men who reported directly to my executive board, not to the hotel's front desk. They knew exactly who I was, and they were fully aware that touching me would not only end their careers instantly, but likely result in massive legal repercussions. Oliver finally moved. He did not address Richard. He did not offer Simone a comforting apology. Instead, he adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit jacket, stepped entirely around the furious billionaire, and began walking directly toward the dark corner of the room. The crowd watched in breathless fascination as the general manager navigated the maze of round tables. The rhythmic sound of his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor echoed loudly through the silent room. Simone stopped her fake crying altogether, pulling away from Trey's chest to watch the scene unfold. A look of profound, creeping confusion washed over her face. She clearly expected Oliver to march over to me with handcuffs, but his pace was entirely too measured, too respectful for an eviction. Oliver stopped exactly 3 feet away from my cheap banquet chair. He did not shout. He did not demand that I stand up. He did not ask me for my side of the story or interrogate me about the supposed physical assault in the executive restroom. Oliver simply stood before me, placed his right hand flat against his chest, and bowed his head in a deep, unmistakable gesture of absolute deference. The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was cinematic. 200 high society guests recoiled in simultaneous shock. Richard's jaw practically unhinged. Simone took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over the hem of her expensive gown. My father's head snapped up from the floor, his eyes widening to the size of saucers, as he watched the most powerful man in the building bow to the outcast daughter he had just begged to sneak out the back door. The mental calculus happening across the room was palpable. You could practically hear the gears grinding in their heads. Why was the general manager bowing to the supposedly broke country girl? Why were the imposing security guards refusing to move an inch? Why was the man they assumed was in charge treating the despised sister with the quiet reverence usually reserved for visiting royalty? Oliver slowly raised his head, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. He ignored the 200 gaping faces staring at us. He ignored Richard's sputtering, breathless outrage. He focused entirely on me. Ma'am, Oliver said, his voice smooth, calm, and projecting, just enough to carry across the dead-silent room to the head table. "The situation in the ballroom has clearly escalated beyond standard event parameters. My security team and I are standing by. We await your direct command." The words hung in the air, heavy and completely undeniable. "We await your direct command." He did not ask me to leave. He did not ask for my compliance. He asked for my orders. I remained seated, my posture relaxed but radiating absolute authority. I let the silence stretch for another long 5 seconds, allowing the crushing reality of the situation to slowly suffocate the arrogance out of the room. I looked at Simone, whose face had drained of all color, replacing her haughty entitlement with sheer, unadulterated terror. I looked at Richard, who was suddenly trembling, realizing that his ultimate trump card had just burst into flames right in his hands. I looked at my brother, who was staring at me as if I had just morphed into a completely different human being. The grand illusion was finally shattered. The elaborate charade of wealth and superiority they had constructed to humiliate me had completely collapsed under the weight of the truth. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable victim they could bully into submission. I was the architect of their current reality, and they were trapped inside my walls. I took a slow, deep breath, enjoying the absolute terrifying quiet of the ballroom. I reached out, picked up my crystal glass of ice water, and took a leisurely sip. The time for blending in was officially over. It was time to introduce them to the real Naomi. I set my crystal glass down on the cheap banquet table. The soft clink of the glass against the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I looked up at Oliver, acknowledging his respectful bow with a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of my head. Then Oliver spoke again, his voice carrying the precise professional weight of an executioner swinging a heavy axe. "Ms. Naomi," he said, turning his cold professional gaze toward Richard and Simone. "Would you like me to have these guests removed from your property?" The word "your" hung in the air, echoing off the vaulted gold leaf ceilings. It was a single devastating syllable that completely shattered the false reality my family had spent decades constructing. Simone's manicured hands immediately went slack. The expensive designer clutch she had been gripping so tightly slipped through her fingers, hitting the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crack that made half the room physically jump. Richard staggered backward, his heavy leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the dance floor. He looked as though all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. His face, previously flushed with arrogant rage and unearned confidence, turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The reaction from my family was equally catastrophic. My mother let out a small, strangled whimper, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as if she were trying to physically hold in her shock. My father slowly sank back into his high-backed chair at the head table, his eyes locked onto me with a mixture of absolute terror and profound, paralyzing confusion. Trey just stood there with his arms still awkwardly wrapped around his bride, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I pushed my chair back and slowly stood up. At 5 feet 10 inches in my heels, I did not need a spotlight or an elevated stage to command the room. I stepped out from the shadows of table 24. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the kitchen hallway faded behind me as I walked directly onto the massive, polished dance floor. The 200 wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, pulling their chairs in and shifting out of my way to give me a wide, unobstructed path. I walked with the slow, deliberate cadence of a woman who owned the ground beneath her feet. Because I did. I walked past the elaborate floral centerpieces I had personally approved. I walked under the massive crystal chandeliers I had paid for in cash. I stopped directly in the center of the room, standing exactly where Richard had stood when he was loudly bragging about his supposed corporate dominance. I looked around the room, making brief, piercing eye contact with the corporate investors who had been sneering at me just moments ago. I let them see the intelligence, the absolute control, and the unyielding power that I had spent the last 12 years building in silence. The whispering in the crowd died completely. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were staring at me with a sudden, terrified reverence. Since my future sister-in-law was so kind as to introduce me earlier, I began, my voice steady, resonant, and entirely unapologetic. Allow me to formally reintroduce myself to the rest of the room. My name is Naomi. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Hospitality Group, and as Oliver just graciously clarified, I am the outright owner of the Grand Azure. The collective gasp from the crowd was truly cinematic. Wives grabbed their husbands' arms in shock. Businessmen who had been enthusiastically clapping for Richard just 20 minutes ago suddenly looked incredibly nervous, frantically trying to remember if they had openly laughed at Simone's cruel jokes. The dynamic of the entire ballroom flipped in the span of 3 seconds. I was no longer the pathetic rural outcast. I was the absolute apex predator in a room full of people who suddenly realized they were standing at the bottom of the food chain. I turned my attention directly to Richard. He was sweating profusely now, heavy beads of moisture gathering on his forehead and rolling down his thick neck. "You mentioned earlier that you are close personal friends with the anonymous owner of this hotel," I said, my tone laced with a lethal, icy politeness. "You claimed we do multi-million-dollar business together. You even bragged to this entire room about sharing a very expensive bottle of scotch with the chief executive officer of Apex during a private, exclusive lunch. I took a slow, measured step toward him. He instinctively took a step back, shrinking away from me as if I were made of fire. That is utterly fascinating to me, Richard. I continued, raising my voice just enough to ensure the investors in the back row heard every single word. Because I do not drink scotch. I have never played a round of golf in my entire life. And until you sat down at my table tonight to offer me a minimum wage warehouse job out of pity, I had absolutely no idea who you were. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and salvage some tiny shred of his dignity, but no words came out. He was completely trapped in a massive web of his own arrogant lies, exposed in front of the very peers he had spent his entire life trying to desperately impress. The investors sitting at the front tables began to mutter among themselves, casting highly suspicious glares at Richard. The illusion of his corporate invincibility was rapidly disintegrating. I shifted my gaze to Simone. She looked absolutely petrified. The cruel, demanding bully who had cornered me in the restroom had vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified woman, realizing she had just declared a brutal war on a billionaire. And Simone, I said, my voice dropping to a softer, but far more dangerous register. You wanted me to stay in the back tonight so I would not ruin your high-class aesthetic. You wanted to publicly humiliate me by dropping a $30,000 bar tab on my table, hoping I would cry and beg for mercy. You tossed $1 million deed into the garbage because you thought my money was not good enough for you. I looked down at the dark red wine stain covering my custom suit, then back up to her wide, panicked eyes. You wanted to prove that you are untouchable, I said, taking one final step closer to the bride. But you are standing in my house. You are drinking my inventory. You are breathing my air. And the only reason you have an aesthetic at all tonight is because I graciously allowed you to rent my property. Simone opened her mouth, her lower lip trembling violently. She looked as though she was about to start crying again, but this time the tears would be entirely genuine. She reached out, trying to grab Trey's arm for support, but my brother had completely frozen in place. Trey was staring at me with a look of profound, devastating realization. The sister he had mocked and belittled his entire life was the actual titan of industry he had been desperately trying to associate with. I did not give them a chance to formulate an apology. I did not give them a chance to backtrack. I turned my head slightly, catching Oliver's eye. The general manager stood at perfect attention, waiting for my command. The unmasking was complete, but the true consequences of their actions were only just beginning. It was time to systematically dismantle the fraudulent empire they had tried to bludgeon me with. I slowly unclasped my silver designer clutch and reached inside, pulling out my cell phone. The bright screen illuminated my face in the dim, heavy tension of the ballroom. I unlocked the device and opened the secure email Oliver had sent me earlier in the evening. It was the comprehensive financial audit of Prime Logistics. Richard watched my fingers move across the glass screen. His eyes were wide and completely unblinking, resembling a man tied to the train tracks watching the locomotive speed toward him. He knew exactly what kind of information a corporate audit contained, and he knew he had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to hide those exact numbers from his shareholders. I looked away from the screen and directed my gaze toward the crowd. I specifically locked eyes with the wealthy investors and corporate partners who had given Richard a standing ovation just an hour ago. Earlier tonight, I projected my voice clearly so it carried to the very back of the massive room Richard stood on this stage, and told you all that he had secured an exclusive multi-million-dollar vendor contract with my company. He told you that Prime Logistics was expanding rapidly, that his financial future was completely unstoppable, and that he was operating at the absolute highest level of corporate America. He used the pristine reputation of Apex Hospitality Group to inflate his own stock in this room and secure your continued investments. I paused, letting the heavy silence magnify my next words. The investors were staring at me with rapt attention, completely captivated by the sudden, brutal shift in power. What Richard conveniently failed to mention to his shareholders, I continued my voice turning to pure ice, is that his company is currently under active investigation by my corporate compliance division for severe contract violations and blatant financial fraud. The word fraud acted like a physical blow to the room. Whispers immediately broke out among the suited men at the front tables. Several of the older businessmen leaned forward, their expressions hardening from polite curiosity into sharp, calculating anger. Richard raised a shaking hand, opening his mouth to object. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice weak and completely devoid of the booming authority he had wielded earlier. "She is making this up." I did not even look at him. I looked down at my phone and began reading the undeniable legally verified data directly to his investors. According to the third quarter metrics finalized by my accounting team this morning, Prime Logistics has been systematically and illegally padding their invoices. I read the numbers loud and clear. You have been applying an 18% unauthorized fuel surcharge to every single delivery made to my southeastern properties. You have completely fabricated expedited shipping fees to mask the fact that your internal supply chain is failing. Your actual profit margins are practically non-existent, and your fleet completely missed the mandatory federal carbon offset filing deadline 3 days ago. I lowered the phone and took a slow, measured step toward the head table. Richard physically flinched. "You are not a titan of industry, Richard," I said, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "You are a desperate man running a sinking ship. You actively stole money from my enterprise to pay for the expensive diamonds around your daughter's neck and the $30,000 worth of vintage champagne you tried to force me to buy. You built this entire evening on a foundation of lies, hoping to use my brother to secure a financial bailout before the banks finally foreclosed on your warehouses." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of angry murmurs. The investors who had previously patted Richard on the back were now actively stepping away from him. I watched as 3 different men in expensive tailored suits immediately pulled their own cell phones out of their pockets, dialing numbers and walking rapidly toward the exit. They were calling their brokers. They were freezing their assets. The social and financial contagion was spreading rapidly, and Richard was the absolute epicenter of the disaster. Simone turned to her father, her face completely pale. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine horror. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them you have the money." Richard could not even look at his daughter. He stared at the polished marble floor, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He had absolutely no defense because every single word I had spoken was backed by a massive paper trail of his own incompetence. I turned away from his pathetic, sweating face and looked directly at my general manager. Oliver was still standing at perfect attention, waiting patiently for his instructions. "Oliver," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Cancel the Apex Logistics contract with Richard's firm, effective immediately. Initiate the corporate clawback protocols for every single unauthorized surcharge they have billed us for the last 6 months. And forward this entire audit directly to our legal department first thing Monday morning to begin aggressive litigation for breach of contract." "Yes," Ms. Naomi Oliver responded smoothly, not missing a single beat. "Consider it done." The sheer finality of Oliver's words acted as the ultimate executioner's block. The multi-million-dollar lifeline Richard had been desperately clinging to was completely severed. Richard's knees physically gave out. He did not gracefully take a seat. He collapsed heavily into the nearest banquet chair, his massive frame slouching forward as if his spine had completely dissolved into dust. The thick, arrogant posture he had carried all night vanished. He buried his face in his large hands, letting out a low, guttural sound of absolute despair that was incredibly uncomfortable to witness. His entire corporate identity, the massive empire he had spent decades bragging about and using to belittle others, was completely erased with a single legally binding sentence. There would be no massive warehouse expansion. There would be no fake vice president title for my brother to hide behind. There would be no 6-bedroom luxury estate in Buckhead for Simone to host high society parties in. Prime Logistics was effectively dead, completely destroyed by the very woman Richard had tried to have thrown out into the alley like common trash. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of their manufactured reality. The feeling of vindication was not loud or boastful. It was a quiet, steady warmth spreading through my chest. I had not needed to raise my voice. I had not needed to throw a tantrum or resort to petty physical violence. I had simply brought the truth into the light and allowed their own toxic actions to crush them. The guests were staring at me in total silence again, completely awestruck by the ruthless efficiency with which I had dismantled one of their own. I had proven that my boundaries were absolute, and the cost of crossing them was total financial ruin. But my business with Richard was concluded. Now I had to deal with the people who had stood by and watched him try to destroy me. I turned my attention slowly toward my own family, ready to deliver the final consequences of their lifelong betrayal. As Richard sat utterly defeated in his chair, the suffocating tension in the ballroom fractured into a frantic, pathetic desperation. The wealthy guests were still scrambling toward the exits, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Prime Logistics, but my immediate family was moving in the exact opposite direction. The moment the reality of my immense wealth fully penetrated their minds, their entire demeanor underwent a sickening, instantaneous transformation. My mother Brenda was the first to break the silence. The woman who had just scolded me for wearing silver and blamed me for having wine deliberately poured on my chest suddenly pushed her way past the remaining guests. Her face, previously twisted with embarrassment and anger, was now stretched into a wide, tearful smile of absolute adoration. "Oh, Naomi," my mother cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She reached out with both arms, rushing toward me as if she were a desperate woman stranded in the desert who had just spotted an oasis. "My brilliant, successful daughter. I knew it. I always knew you were doing incredible things out there in the country. We are so incredibly proud of you." She lunged forward to wrap her arms around me fully, expecting me to accept this sudden, miraculous display of maternal affection. I took a sharp, deliberate step backward. My mother stumbled slightly, her arms grasping at empty air. She looked hurt, her eyes widening in feigned confusion as her hands fell awkwardly to her sides. My father stepped up right behind her, offering me a nervous, completely transparent smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He opened his mouth to echo her ridiculous sentiments, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice dangerously low and completely devoid of warmth. "Do not stand there and pretend you have ever been proud of me. You spent my entire life treating me like a burden. You called me a failure. You hid me in the back corner of this room tonight because you were terrified I would embarrass you in front of a man who is actively committing corporate fraud. You do not get to claim my success now just because you realize I hold the keys to the castle." Trey suddenly shoved his way past our parents. He looked completely unhinged. His custom tuxedo was rumpled, his bow tie was crooked, and he was sweating profusely. The smug, entitled golden child had completely evaporated. He was terrified. He realized that the luxurious future he had planned for himself was currently burning to the ground, and he was desperate to salvage the ashes. "Naomi, please," Trey begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You cannot do this. You cannot cancel the Apex contract with Richard. Simone is furious. She just told me that if her father goes bankrupt and I do not get that vice president job, she is calling off the wedding. She will leave me, Naomi. You have to reconsider. You are my sister. You have to fix this for me." He had just admitted it out loud in front of everyone. He had confirmed everything I had said in the hallway. Simone did not love him, and he did not love her. Their entire relationship was a hollow financial transaction, and without my money actively funding the illusion, the bride was ready to walk away. I looked at my brother, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, settling peace. I had spent 35 years agonizing over why I was never good enough for this family. I had spent decades trying to earn their respect, trying to prove my worth, and trying to protect them from their own terrible decisions. But looking at Trey begging me to save a relationship built on pure greed, the heavy chains of familial obligation simply dissolved. I cannot fix anything for you, Trey, I replied calmly, because I am not playing this game anymore. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at my brother. I let my eyes sweep over the three people who had caused me so much unnecessary pain. You told me to stay in the back and blend in tonight, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the rapidly emptying ballroom. You told me not to cause a scene and to let the real wealth take the spotlight. Well, I am doing exactly what you asked. I am blending right out of your lives. I am done being your scapegoat. I am done being your safety net. I am done with this family. My parents stared at me in horrified silence. Trey dropped his head into his hands, realizing that his ultimate bailout had just permanently closed its doors. I had drawn the absolute final boundary, and it was carved in stone. I turned my back on my family and shifted my attention to Simone. She was standing near the head table, no longer faking her distress. She was crying genuine heavy tears of absolute panic. Her perfect makeup was ruined, running down her cheeks in dark streaks. She looked completely broken, entirely stripped of the arrogant superiority she had weaponized against me all evening. Simone, I called out, ensuring she made direct eye contact with me. She flinched, wrapping her arms tightly around her torso as she looked at the woman she had tried to destroy. By the way, I said, offering her a cold, polite smile. That massive $12,000 champagne bill you tried to crush me with earlier. Consider it a parting gift. Because as the owner of this hotel, I am officially voiding your catering contract for the rest of the evening. Simone let out a choked sob, realizing the finality of my words. You, your fraudulent father, and everyone else associated with this absolute disaster of an engagement party have exactly 15 minutes to vacate my building, I announced to the room. If anyone is still standing on my property, when that time expires, my security team will have you escorted out in handcuffs. I turned to Oliver, who gave me a sharp, affirming nod. He immediately lifted his radio to his mouth, quietly issuing the final eviction orders to the rest of the tactical security staff waiting in the lobby. I did not wait to watch them scramble. I did not need to see Richard packing up his bruised ego or my family crying over their lost golden ticket. I turned on my heel, my designer shoes clicking against the marble floor, and walked straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors and stepped out into the quiet, opulent lobby. The hotel staff parted respectfully as I walked past them. The valet was already waiting out front, holding the door to my sleek black town car open. I stepped out from beneath the massive glass canopy of the Grand Azure and took a deep breath of the crisp, cool Atlanta night air. It smelled like absolute freedom. I slid into the soft leather seat of my car, and the driver immediately pulled away from the curb, leaving the chaos and the toxicity of my past entirely in the rearview mirror. For so long, I had carried the heavy burden of my family's rejection. I had let their limitations dictate how I viewed myself. But as the bright city lights blurred past my window, I realized the most profound truth of my entire life. The greatest revenge is not anger or violence. The greatest revenge is massive, undeniable success, and the absolute refusal to share it with the people who tried to bury you. I had built an empire from the ground up, relying on nothing but my own brilliance and sheer determination. I had secured my financial independence, and tonight I had finally secured my emotional independence. The healing process would continue, but I was no longer bleeding from the wounds they had inflicted. I was free. If you are watching this and you have ever felt abandoned, belittled, or betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, please hear this. Your worth is not determined by their inability to value you. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep toxic family members warm. You have every right to walk away, to build your own empire, and to fiercely protect your peace. Thank you for letting me share my story tonight. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to draw a hard boundary with toxic relatives and how it changed your life. Please like and subscribe for more stories about resilience, corporate strategy, and the beautiful journey of creating the life you truly deserve. Remember, family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes the most beautiful family is the one you choose to build for yourself.